All right, well, hello everyone. Welcome to the 414th meeting of the New York Comics and Picture Story Symposium. This is a weekly reading series founded by Ben Catcher, the cartoonist and educator Ben Catcher. Ben founded this series over a decade ago. It's open to people who make comics, people who write about comics, people who think about comics in some way, maybe work within some aspect of the comics industry or comic self-publishing. And it's a free form platform where anyone who we invite, if it's an artist, they can but they can speak about their own work if they like. They can speak about an issue in art or an issue in life beyond art that they're interested in. There's no restraints on what people can present. Um, and Ben is was lucky to have this series funded for many years through Parsons, so that the idea was that the series would always be open to the public for free. It used to meet in person. Now it's a mix of being in person and online. But the idea was that it would always be free to the public in the sense that these would be talks that maybe a university might curate for their students, and there'd have to be a fee associated with that. Ben's idea was to make these kinds of talks open to the public, but provide an honorarium to the person speaking, to the guest. And that honorarium now is provided with great generosity by the Will and Ann Eisner Foundation. So we thank them for their funding of this series. This season of the symposium is co-curated by Ben Catcher, myself, my name's Austin English, Bill Cardilopoulos, and Lily Correa. We have about 10 other meetings scheduled for this season. We have I'll just read some of the highlights. We're going to have Olivia Shrowen speak to the symposium. Really legendary cartoonist Carol Leigh will be joining us. We're going to have a week dedicated to Jules Feiffer, remembering Jules Feiffer. Laura Park will be a guest. We have new cartoonists Sarah Kirby and Sam Siegel speaking, and we will end the season with comics historian Dan Nadel talking about his new biography of Robert Crumb. So there's lots of dates in this series that if you that if you the way that you found out about this one, you'll find out about the other events um through whatever platform you found this in. If you one thing that I want to mention at the top is that almost all our talks, with a couple of exceptions, are posted to our YouTube page, which is youtube.com/at NY Comic Symposium. Um, I really recommend go like subscribing to that channel because we are really it's not every date of the symposium from when it met in person is there, but the last 5 years of the symposium's meetings are there for the most part, and it really is a resource that I feel like we're building an archive with it. If you're a comics researcher, a comics academic, or someone who just loves the form, an artist yourself who wants to hear directly from an artist's ideas and thoughts. It's a great resource that we encourage you to look up, and this talk will be posted to it later as well. So we are so lucky to have Anand here speaking to us, and he's coming all the way from India. It's very early there, so we're very grateful to him for making time for us. I first encountered his work through this book, which was published by Bubbles, the very popular and beloved Bubbles fanzine. They've published a few books now. This is I think one of the most beautiful ones they've done. This collects the first three issues of Stories from Zoo by Anand, and a new issue has been published by the author since then. This collects the first three issues and some short stories. This was my first exposure to the work, and I believe the first exposure of many people. And I think I was just really exhilarated when I first saw it. It was my first exposure to this artist, and it really was a fully formed. It was like reading someone for the first time, and the work was so fully formed. The drawing itself was immediately beautiful to look at. I really felt this connection to the work of a cartoonist who I love named Megan Kelso, a great master of the short story comics form. And when I looked at the work in this book, it felt like someone really working with the short story form, and not presenting characters in um, some kind of puzzle-like way where one person exists to interact with the other character and create some kind of contrast. Each character presented in these works are fully molded, fully formed, and interact with other characters in this really deep and unexpected way, and they're just simply a joy to read. So I was so grateful to encounter this book, and one of the joys of the symposium is getting to hear more directly from uh, the artist making these works because I don't know much about the circumstances around these works rather than reading it. Um, Before we kick things over to our guest, I just want to say that this part of the idea of the symposium is a unity between audience and speaker. So while the presentation is going, if you have any questions, even a question you think is silly or unformed, the idea of the symposium is for people to be here with the speaker and ask any question that comes into their mind and be part of the presentation. So please be sure to not ignore that question. You can write it into the chat, or and you can indicate that you just want me to call on you. You can write that question while the presentation is going, or you can write it after it's completed. So, without further ado, let's let Anand take it away. Thank you.
Thank you, Austin. Thank you for the kind words and thank you for having me here. It's an honor sharing space with like cartoonists who have come before, but I'll just share my screen real quick. I have a presentation prepared, and today I'll just be talking about my work and how, as I said, arrived at comics and what I like about the medium and the influences. I'll go story by story and what influenced me to make them. So I'll just start. Welcome. So comics, like I it wasn't like my first medium of choice. Like, a lot of people when they're young, they immediately get attracted and like to the medium. And uh, like I know a lot of people who started very young with me comics, but with me, like I always read comics. When I was young, I used to read this magazine called Tinkle, which was like this mix of what do you call it? Humorous stories and um, sort of stories which taught kids ethics and morals and like just information of things around the world. Um, it was nothing like groundbreaking, but it was the only thing at least I had, and but it was still like quite interesting to me. And this was how I learned to read, and also like how I learned to read comics as a medium, and which made me aware of like what this medium does. And then uh, like I slowly moved on to things like Archies, and even that was quite fascinating to me and like for some reason comforting to read. But like I look back and I feel like there's nothing relatable to me to like for me to those stories because it's like lives of these American teenagers in these suburbs. And but it was just kind of like the images really, it was interesting to see how inter- how they sort of made these environments and like uh then, when I was around eighth grade, I read Persepolis and, came to know about alternative comics and uh, just became aware of like this entire different world of comics which I didn't know of, and that led me to finding out about Crumb and Spiegelman and all these other like underground and alternative cartoons. But I was never really prompted to make my own comics then, and I sort of realized it much later why, but I'll talk about it later. But when I was young, I he was obsessed with making clay figurines and like doing animation. I'm going to show like one of the first ventures into uh what do you call it? Into sequential storytelling. And it's this. It's like this worm which walks across the room. This was like the first thing I'd ever made. And it was I mean the medium was fascinating to me. Like you could create these movements and I would make figurines like this, and this was kind of my start into um sort of creating storylines in my head and creating characters and just sort of sitting with them and creating these worlds. But and I wouldn't even draw that much, but at some point I realized drawing was like the foundation of any creative venture. Like at one point I really wanted to be in films and like, be like a cinematographer or something, and or like a director. And like, I found out that Scorsese drew his own storyboard. So I kind of got into drawing, and then during this point, there was this whole art boom in India where, making art became really financially rewarding to a lot of people, and you would see like more and more shows pop up. So, like, I would also, try to make these sort of images and uh, like paintings and illustrations. And so it was, and like I always wanted to approach comics, but it just felt like this was one of my very early comics. It's just like this, my experience going to like this local barber shop, and I was friends with this guy, and like we would go talk, and like, he had this radio on, and I would listen to those songs and like, get a haircut and come back. So, but my world sort of revolved mostly around animation and like making sculptures. And like my dream was to go to this design college which had this animation course. And in my mind, I would just go there and like make animation films. But then that college never like accepted me. So I ended up going to like this fine arts college in a city called Bangalore. And I was mostly making paintings, and I was in the sculpture department. So I'd make sculptures, and but like the college was a little strange in the sense it didn't really have a very what do you call it? Um, like the sort of dialogue going on, or people didn't really, I guess, like um necessarily also come from like backgrounds where they had a lot of exposure to the art world per se. And people, a lot of them seemed a little disinterested even while being in the art, and a lot of professors were disinterested. So it was a cycle of like disinterest and lethargy which I was caught in between. So I wouldn't really uh like, I guess I would do more in school than after actually went to uh like an art college. And also like um I started getting really like uh disillusioned by the whole art world because um it didn't feel like anything interesting was happening there, and it felt quite limiting in certain sense, because it felt like it was the market which was running how people were making works or like creating images. It was sort of dictated by a very limited sort of language and understanding, and like it was the interest of a very few people which was dictating the entire art world. So I was kind of like and also it was the time where I was getting more and more politically aware, and a lot of things were happening in the country when after I joined the college. um, like this right wing party came into power, and like you could see things happening around you, like how it was affecting. People, especially like the marginalized, and like I was coming to know all like the his what do you call it? Um, Historically, like how messed up India's sort of uh, socio-political history is, and like how I come from a point of privilege. And I feel like once people realize that they either go into like when they're young and they either go into a mode of like trying to save people, trying to like do something and become, revolutionaries, or they go into this point of like guilt of like having privilege in this thing. And I went into this whole feeling of like, oh, I've had so much, what do I even make work about? And it just felt um quite like limiting to be an artist in that sense. Like, it felt like what was the point of doing this? The world is in such a bad place, and um so I mean I was in a really like weird zone in an art college where I was kind of like clueless. But oh, this was like this animation I had this was like this animation I'd made for a like an art festival. Uh, it was like this thing I'd sort of put together digitally. Okay. But anyway, and then, but during my final year, I sort of became friends with this classmate of mine. We'd never spoken for the 4 years I was actually there, and then during the last year, we spoke, and like I realized we both had an interest in publishing and doing like physical print stuff. And we had always been like wrong groups where nobody else was interested. So we got together, and like it was fun working with him as well, because how I'd seen like people approach like especially like comics or things, it was I guess a little slower, where they would like want to perfect it. They would make drafts, old drafts. But this guy, like, we had this plan for a book, and he was illustrating it, and he comes to me with these drawings, and they were pretty rough. And I I was like, oh, are you going to develop this more? He's like, no, this is it. And we just went the next day and sort of printed it out, and it was quite fast. Like, within 3, 4 days, we had the book in our hands, and we were distributing it, selling it to our people in our college. And then like we kept making these different zines and comics and books. And I guess that part of uh, like that part point in call like point of time really helped, because it sort of helped me demystify the process of like printing and publishing. It felt like it was possible. You could just go to like a local Xerox shop and actually make something which, if you design it well, if you format it well, make something really presentable. And also, like, this point of time in college really felt like I was in an institute with other creative people, where everybody was giving their inputs, everybody was sort of helping assemble the book, helping sell the book, helping giving. And we would mostly like take works which people were doing in their studios in college, and sort of help them create, or like collectively create like narratives around it, and sort of present them as comics. So this was a very early comic I had actually made for someone else, this other person who was studying in a design college in the same city. And he wanted to do like this comics project where he would create like a small sort of publishing press. But it never worked out, so I just published it through our small collective, and this is part of it. So, but like eventually I started making these slightly long format comics as well. This one is called Sponge Cake. It's from 2018. And I guess I would describe them as like these sad boy comics where it's like this very self-critical sort of zone where it's mostly kind of like these characters who are criticizing themselves and but it was fun. It was like fun to sort of make them and distribute it and like put them out in the world. And then I made this, and this is like this sort of double book I'd made where from one side it's one story and you flip it over and there's this other story. So it's called Things I Lost When I Was Looking for Something and Things I Found When I Was Not Looking for Anything. And the like the left one had like this sort of like a meta narrative where like the protagonist of the story talks about how he's lost the antagonist and he's kind of like it's affected him in a way that he says that my story doesn't make any sense without an antagonist, and it's about him sort of finding one. But the left one, the right side of the story was more like I sort of came out of this comfort because I feel like both this Sponge Cake and this other comic, it had this very art college sort of sensibilities to them in a way where like I'm making images and sort of running a dialogue or like running as an ongoing story, but like it doesn't necessarily have any relation to the image which is there. It's just like the still image and there's just a story running with it. But with this other comic, like it was about how I used to go to the city called Mysore, which was nearby to where I was studying, and my I used to go meet my friend Partha, who used to like stay and work there, and it was like this really lovely time because it was this great city, and I would go there, and we would go around the city, eat, work, and I just wanted to like capture that time and like space with them. So that was like probably my first venture into making something which was like based in an actual space with like actual characters. And that I guess, felt kind of rewarding to me. Kind of felt like um uh it just felt better, like than making something more abstract, more something which uh like would maybe a layman wouldn't ever read. Someone who never had an art education or like an art background. But yeah, so like after this comic, um, there was like a bunch of changes which happened in my life and like quite big shifts in like how I approached bookmaking and comics. And uh, like after this, like the pandemic happened and I was stuck in this town called Mangalore, which is like my hometown in my aunt's house. And like I didn't have my like my regular materials. I was not in my studio, so I was forced to sort of look around the internet and like research more on things without like my regular thing. So at that time I read a lot of other comics which like I had never read it from like a certain lens. For example, like I read a lot of Tomine and like DeForge and Julie Doucet. Um, and like I found out they used to do, one person anthologies, and it wasn't like all of a sudden that they made these graphic novels and like full length comics. So that I think was quite, it sort of struck something in me. Like, oh, I don't have to necessarily, if I'm making comics, not necessarily, uh, work for like years on like one story, just perfecting it. I can do it in smaller batches and sort of like take, bite what I can chew at one point. And that happened, and like, I was sort of tired of like because when I was making these comics, I had this sort of thought process that comics can be anything. And comics like which I'd used to read, like how I showed Tinkle, which had a very uh classic tone to it, or like sometimes even a didactic tone to it. I felt like I wanted to break the form and make something of my own. And uh but I felt in this process of like comics could be anything, and there's so many things. It felt quite limiting to me as to what I was making. And I guess like I was taking too much time making them as well. Like would spend like a whole year just making a few images, and it felt very um like it felt like I still had that art school hangover with these comics. So I really wanted to go to like the basics of it and use like base them in like wanted to create a much stronger sense of space and a stronger sense of like actual characters and how they're interacting with each other, and like how that sort of guides or like creates um, a certain mood for the reader. And I was there. And another like very important thing was that I was really disappointed or like underwhelmed by the comics scene in India, where it felt like uh, all the work which was coming out were in these molds. It was either like funny educational stuff for children, or it was like quite academic stuff which spoke about like important issues going on, or spoke about um, spoke about things in a very academic way. A lot of them felt more like illustrations with essays and like it just didn't feel like it was uh, completely utilizing the medium of comics. So that was that was the other thing. So like during that time I was and of course like the third mold of Indian comics being like using mythology and sort of adapting it in this sort of DC Marvel style of like hyper realism. And it just felt like it's oscillating in between these things. And I wanted to like actually create some uh fun stories which one could read. I mean, I don't like the term, but like good adult fiction comics. And uh like also felt like another thing which was holding me back, like when I mentioned Persepolis and all these comics, was when this sort of um these graphic novels started to come to India. It felt like it was marketed in, or like interpreted it in a way where uh like it felt like it was just about one thing. Like for example, it felt like when people read Mouse, it would for them just be a comic about the Holocaust. And it just felt like it was so much more. And people would like for some even like Persepolis, reading that as an eighth grader, as some boy who grew up in India, like it was still quite fascinating and like relatable to read like the experiences of someone living in Iran during the revolution, and like how they sort of went through all of that and navigating a space. So it just felt like people were putting it in a certain mold, and there was, or like the immediate um what do you call it? Like the immediate identity of it, rather than exploring what it could be. And also, like in my mind, I had this idea that I don't know how to draw properly. Like I don't know anatomy properly, or I don't know things like perspective properly. So one day when I know everything, that's when I'll draw a comic. But then I realized that day might never come. So basically that's when the idea for Zoo came about. And uh, it first started with this story, Lovers in a Metro. And this started like around February of 2020. I was there was this It was kind of like a weird time in India where people were protesting like this very uh anti-human rights law which the government was passing, which sort of forced people to prove that they had ancestry in India. It was kind of like quite um, like against the marginalized communities, and people across the country were like protesting it, and um, it was quite a strange time, but also like quite a resilient time. But anyway, so I saw online that there was this communist youth organization in Delhi, and they wanted to like involve artists in these protests and see what they can do with them. So I had gone for this meeting, and they wanted to do something on Valentine's Day with the sense of like love in the time of revolution, and they wanted to read out poetry by leftist poets and like freedom fighters and people who had like involvement in the Indian independence movement. So I came up with this idea of like these two people meeting in the Delhi metro and them having like this quarrel in between them. Basically because like the Delhi metro being a really uh, quite an interesting space in the sense like it's one of the biggest like transportation service in Delhi, and like it connects different parts of the city, and just the kind of like people you see and the kind of conversations you are kind of forced to overhear in that space, and the kind of interactions you see. And especially like India is not a place where uh, it's common to see people show affection in in public spaces, just because like how our uh, it's kind of like a moral policing thing as well. So it's kind of like how lovers find that space in like such a public space like metro. So I had made that for and it was um like it was kind of in this time crunch. I had to make it in a week, and but it was really fun. Like this was the first time I had sort of approached something you know fictional where I'm making these characters and sort of using the space, but it was quite um like it sort of opened a lot of things up with what I could do with comics, like how I could create a sense of space, and how, like for example, here I was using the metro, and it was kind of like problem solving in some sense. Like you create certain dialogues and like you find loopholes, and you kind of try to um try to what do you call it, make sense of things, or like how you try to make the characters um more what do you call believable, or like their situations more believable. So it's quite fun. And then I published this, printed it out like this, Xeroxed it, and like distributed it for free to the people who were like observing this protest. And then eventually the pandemic came, and then I was, as I said, stuck in my aunt's house. And that time, like I came up with a story called Sofa, and this is not in the Bubbles anthology because uh, this story I wrote in Hindi at first, and when I made like I wrote in Hindi, and it felt quite hard to translate it. A lot of things were lost in translation. But this story is essentially about this man who comes to Delhi for some work, and he's supposed to stay with this family friend in their house, and he notices that they're not there, and there's this person he's never seen, and she claims to be like their niece. And then uh, he sort of observes that there is this room which he thinks is the guest room, but she makes him sleep on this sofa in the drawing room. And then he starts like getting he's uncomfortable in that space, and he starts like losing sleep, and he starts like hallucinating all these things. But like I think essentially at the end he's just offended that she didn't give him that space. And it was quite inspired by like the kind of way hospitality or is looked at in India, especially like towards men. Like I would like see this quite a lot in like families where the men would travel to like different places for work and stuff, and whenever someone where they've traveled to would come to our house, it would be like, oh, we should make them we should make them here because they looked after me so well. But like it's like the women would never travel, but they would have to look after them even just because they looked after. I mean, I guess it's courteous, but still, in some sense, it felt like it was this whole idea of hospitality and this idea of like making your guest feel overtly welcome was a very sometimes a very gendered thing and sometimes a very like thing which other people would have to put effort for. But it was still a fun comic to draw. It was after the Metro comic, this was definitely a longer one, and but it was fun like trying to, and you can see like how in the first place like the face never matches. It looks like it's some five different people. So it was means like I was still trying to get a grasp of the medium and of like telling stories. So um so yeah, that was so far. It never got, but like I was still like quite happy with some of the choices I made. For example, in this second page, there I made the panels look like a sofa. I was quite pleased by these things. I was like quite trying to experiment with the medium, and uh, this was the other story, People Photo Studio, and this would quite often happen. I would do this where like it was first just a sketch which I had randomly made in my sketchbook. And then like I thought, oh, it could be like the story where, all this is happening. And as I said, I was in my hometown back then. And I was like reading up a lot about the kind of political situation there and what was happening and like the history of that place and how it's kind of involved in a lot of like messed up parts of where we are right now. So like I kind of want to delve into that also, but also like I had this idea where how could I make it kind of interesting, and I thought it was fascinating, like what if it's like this background which moves and like the character can just like enter. And this is also quite inspired by this Michael DeFore story where it's like this photo, it's called photo album, where like the photos move around time and space. So and like this nostalgia with which a lot of Indian people have with like these painted background studios where people would take family photographs there, and it has a lot of like history uh for people. So and like I thought it would be interesting for this character who's like this totally sort of like fantastical, like sort of he's clearly like not someone who's from that city in certain sense, but for him to be based in the city, which kind of has like this uh, history of whatever settler colonialism and right-wing politics, for him to be in the city and how it's sort of nobody cares for this sort of fantastical element this person has, this kind of thing that person has. So sort of exploring that was quite interesting. And this was like the first issue. So I don't know who my audience is. I don't know who's going to read this. I don't know how people are going to uh, interpret it or like, um, you know. So that was kind of like very freeing as well because I don't have anything. I'm not bound by anything. I'm not, because now I feel in some person and I'll be like, oh, or like some sort of demographic that I have, and I'll think about, oh, will this be relatable to them, or like Will it come across as boring to them? Is this sort of topping what I have done so far? Is it like worse than what I've done so far? So, but this, like the first issue was like totally, and even the second issue. So this was 4 years from like the second issue I had done. And this was also like I was just making this drawing for fun. And even the person with the 4 years, the pointing years, I was kind of making like this uh like this dog faced guy, and it looked a lot like Lisa Hannawald's drawing, so I just like made it into a person rather than like keeping it. So, and I was showing this drawing to a friend, and they were like, "Oh, is this part of the new comic?" And it felt like I could do something with these characters, so I just kept on like developing a storyline. And this story was quite influenced by Indian sitcoms in the 90s and 2000s, and how it had like this sort of bizarre humor and like even cheesy sometimes. So, and like even this character, like his father's character, is someone who's always behind the newspaper, and that was directly from this TV show called Tutu Meme, where this one character is never shown. He's always behind the newspaper. And like I kind of wanted to adapt that flat lighting and like how sets look in some sense, where you can only see it from one angle, like a multi-camera setup, this thing. So I was kind of trying to adapt that. And also like I, during this whole like pandemic stuck in Mangalore point, I got in like introduced to the work of Simon Hanselman, which I found was quite fascinating. And just the way he sort of developed his characters. And especially when I read Bad Gateway, I felt like it was quite an amazing moment, because like how he sort of kept developing these characters, and they're doing all these crass and these nihilist activities, and suddenly it gets really real, and it just hits you. So like that part was quite fascinating. And also the way his book is kind of like, not in a bad way, but like decorative, in the sense how he designs the world, and like how it's kind of like um uh diverting from that whole cutesy this thing. But this water tanker scene was from there's also this part in one of Simon's comic where like Werewolf Jones climbs this water tanker drunk. But also like water tankers are quite a fascinating part of like the landscape of Indian cities. So I felt it was fun to put it there. Then there was Shoot the Messenger, which was me kind of navigating what it means to be like this sort of like a middle class man surviving in like this internet era, and how one navigates like relationship with family and romantic interests. And Shoot the Messenger, like a direct reference to like Facebook Messenger, because it was kind of like an important part of like every millennial's life, I guess, like, and how we sort of looked at people around us, friendships or like romance changed quite drastically with the internet. So I just wanted to like create the story, and also um what do you call it? Like I just had this idea where like, oh, it would be funny if there's this character whose things are being sold online, and he what do you call it? He just cannot find out why. And then like I sort of start building it up and putting in a lot of effort. So, this on the left, while I was making this film, there was this, while I was making this comic, there was this film I was watching, which coincidentally, it's called Teddy Bear. It's like it's some European film, but it had quite similar themes where like this man is trying to go somewhere, and like his mother just doesn't want him to go. So the day he's leaving home, she doesn't even like leave the bed and just says goodbye without even looking at him. So I kind of referenced that because I thought it was interesting. And also like the part where the character hides like this box of things which is stolen was directly from the show Dexter, where the man is like this secret psychopath, like this serial killer, and he sort of keeps blood of his victims as a trophy. So, and then there was Memento Mori, which I guess like unknowingly started the project when long ago when I was in school, I'd gone to Mangalore for my holidays, and like this was pre-internet era where like you had nothing to do, you were just stuck in your grandparents' house. So that time I used to like find the local newspapers and the obituaries that would come there quite fascinating in the sense like it was interesting pictures, and like just to think who were these people, where did they come from, um and how people remember them. It just felt interesting, and then I had a lot of like clippings from that time which I changed the names, but I used them as a reference in the comic. But also like I thought, like I always found uh stories and like this thing about storytelling more interesting than storytelling itself, or like writing, uh like how people approach writing or how people think about writing or creating is quite interesting, I feel. So like it's this person who's trying to be a writer, and she's kind of created like this system um to feel like what does grief feel like and what does separation feel like, and she has kind of done this kind of like a game for herself, but she gets too sucked into it where to a point where like the writing part is left and it's just this sort of this sort of what do you call it, system she's left with. And yeah, that was I guess pretty much it. But like that whole obituary part fascinating. And then showmanship was quite influenced by my time in art college. This is actually the sculpture, like the place we see is the sculpture department where like I studied in college. And this was an important story because like when I was growing up, I have an uncle who's like an artist, and the way he would talk about, and like he was from like this small town, and he went to an art college, and he was when there was not a big art scene, and then there was this whole boom, and like there were more things coming up. But the way he spoke about the art scene and like people in art, it was pretty scandalous in the sense like he would of course, like he was from a different generation, and the way he looked at things was quite different. But it was interesting to be in that space, and like when you look at a certain space, and you see people doing their own work, you think it's interesting. But when you know for someone else from a different generation, it's like uh it's weird to them, or it's strange to them. So, and like as I said earlier, there was like this boom era, and I feel like the generation which studied art previously and post like 2010s art world and design world, like it was quite a drastic change, and like how they looked at things was very different. How they approached them was very different. So I just kind of wanted to navigate that space in showmanship. And even Cold Brother, it kind of started as this joke, like a gag, where this person like opens a fridge door and they go, approach something, and then like, in a horror story fashion, like a hand comes from nowhere. But the joke is that, oh, it's a boy who lives in the fridge. And then I had this joke, but then it felt like, oh, there was so many possibilities to it where I could just like stop stop the story from becoming like a mere joke, and just where it's these characters who first have no like backgrounds, or like they don't have they're just like characters who exist merely for the joke, and then suddenly like they're real people who have uh like this sort of what do you call it? Who have their, I mean, the sister hates the brother because she thinks he's running away from things, and the brother is like, and I guess it was for me kind of like a metaphor for like how like the generation I grew up with who had like access to internet, who had access to a lot more like social understanding of things around me, and how it sort of alienated them from the generation before, which, feels like, which is a little more, uh, what do you call it? A little less affected in the way we are with like things going on around us, and how it sort of alienates them from like whatever their parents or grandparents. So I thought it was like interesting to explore. And then like 6 feet. This is a reference to like one of the first influential B grade um, horror film made by these two brothers called made by these bunch of brothers called Ramsey brothers, who used to make they used to make like these underground horror films, and they were like some 6 7 brothers, and each of them would be involved in one aspect of filmmaking. So that's why I named the place which this story is situated in Ramsey Nagar as well. But their first film was called Cheh Gaz Zameen Ke Niche, so it's a direct translation. But with this story as well, like I find uh, hearing like the stories behind the films and like the lore behind the films much more interesting sometimes than the film itself. Like the effect films and art and like culture has on people is quite fascinating. You know how sometimes like small things create like big changes in society, or like just like on big changes on like individuals, and how they sort of go with it, take it to, it's like so. But yeah, that and like sort of also this kind of idea of like idols, and how uh what do you do when like you have um like say an influential figure in your life, and then he turns out or they turn out to be like evil. How do you navigate your everything that you learned, your what do you call it, your faith, or like your belief system. So, and I incorporated a lot of these B grade film posters in between. So, yeah, and all of it was collected in Stories from Zoo, which was published by Bubbles last year. Wonderful Bubbles fanzine. And was, I guess, this is the reason why, quite a big reason why I'm here, and why I got to be in this scene with like all these other, really wonderful artists. And I just like, I guess, as I said, like comics wasn't like, I didn't grow up like drawing comics. So, at this point, I feel it's, it doesn't flow out as, I mean, I guess no medium, like every medium has its, it is slow to make it, but like, I feel like struggle sometimes to, especially if it doesn't come out like I want it to. Um, but still, like I love the medium, and there are things which I want to explore with it, and things which I feel like it can, like a sense of time and space which it can create, which like other mediums cannot. Like even with animation, like I feel it was, it's a very collaborative medium where I, you one needs like a lot of people to be involved, and but here, like, I love the fact that I can just sit and create these worlds and create these people. So yeah, that's all I've prepared. I feel at this point like I've spoken too much, and now words are colliding in my mind, and I'm starting to go into some nonsense zone. So I'll finish before I
No, it's the opposite of nonsense. That was wonderful. Thank you so much. And I noted down a bunch of questions I wanted to ask you as you were speaking. There was already someone in the chat who wants to ask a question, Nika, who I'll call on in just one moment. But I did want to just start off with one question, and I encourage other people who have questions at this time, to to write them down or ask me to call on you. But before we begin that, I kind of wanted to, you said something, as I'm looking at your images on the screen, um, I see from when you begin, so even in how the characters pose themselves on the page, a real intention for what you specifically want to do in this medium. I mean, you talked about influences you have, and I can trace certain influences, but I also see a very unique sensibility immediately. And I was very interested in, you talked about this moment. It seemed to be maybe right before you began making comics, where you're viewing works like Persepolis come in and the way that it's talked about as, and I really relate to what you're saying that yes, comics, it's like shoehorning comics into this thing where it's like, yeah, it does this thing where it'll talk about it can be serious as long as it talks about a historical perspective or something like that. As long as it's about a monumentous traumatic event, you can make a comic
Of
around that and
course.
that'll make it serious. Um, and you were saying that these kind of comics were sort of limiting what comics could be. And I'm kind of wondering at this moment, because then I see you get it, your belief of what they can be in your art, in ways that hopefully we can ask more questions about. But I was very interested in what in that moment you felt they could be that they weren't being shown to be in that moment in time.
Yeah, like exactly how you said, it felt like it had to be about something very important for it to exist or for it to be taken seriously. But I just found like a certain joy in it being like meaningless as well, or like about something really mundane. Like I like to call my comics domestic drama. Like I want to base them around uh that's also why I call it zoo, because it's like, how you observe animals in zoo. I would want to observe like people in this sort of setting where, it can be an institution, it can be their house, or like even like the metro. It's kind of like, a enclosed space where you're observing them, not with like any lens uh of good or bad necessarily, or like so yeah, that's what. And like as I mentioned, Bad Gateway as well, like it's a book where it's like a bunch of like fictional characters who are like very cartoony, but it deals with like such real things without like being in some sense like preachy about it, or in some sense like coming off as something which is like something you need to know a lot to read, in some sense, because I felt a lot of Indian comics were about like really heavy subjects where you sort of needed some sort of research before even like approaching it. So that sort of aspect I really liked about comics, where you could you know even like you could talk about something very niche, very important in a very intimate way, in a very like way which like also in some sense ignites like some curiosity in the reader. But at the same time, like I really wanted my comics to be in some sense like entertaining. Also like how I saw other Indian comics be, where they're like really didactic and really like um what do you call, set in like a very specific thing, but like especially the first one, like I'm doing a lot of like visual and verbal jokes and doing a lot of like references to very specific Indian things. Uh, so yeah, I think that was, what attracted me to them. Like I was reading a lot of early Optic Nerve, and that was quite opening to me in the sense, yeah, this could, and even like Julie to say how she was, creating like all these, uh, like these really cluttered, crazy settings, and uh, like it wasn't about anything in particular, but it was about so much simultaneously. So I guess that was,
It almost seems like it's instead of the subject matter signaling a sense of importance and then the importance being achieved just by saying that you're attempting a quote unquote important subject. It's the work itself because you're talking about wanting the work to be entertaining, but to me, I mean, the work is it's extremely exciting to read and involving, but I wouldn't say that it's also just it has a real sense of importance and depth to it. Like you're almost talking about it as if you're like cutting yourself off from depth, but I feel it just from the cartooning itself first and the subject matter forming itself through that.
yeah, like again, like when I was talking about the art world, it felt like there was this, or like in any sort of creative industry, there's this whole high and low aspect of it. Like there's high art, there's low art in films, in artworks, in like literature. But I just felt like with comics, it was kind of blurring the line where something which isn't, overtly trying to be profound is profound.
Yeah.
Something which isn't trying really hard to be um, serious or important kind of ends up being that. Like, it kind of uh, like I feel like it kind of seeps in while you're reading it, and after you reading it, you sort of uh, like even like something like it's a good life if you don't I'm
Good
forgetting
Life
it.
If
Like
You
it's
Don't Weaken by
yes, if you
Seth.
don't
Yes,
weaken.
yes.
Yeah, it's like it's really beautiful imagery, and it's like so beautifully drawn, and like I like it because it sort of reads like some sort of detective novel where this one detective is sort of investigating this murder, but it's about him finding, it's about something very niche and very like very nerdy of him to find uh find like some obscure artist, but like it sort of says so much about life, and it says so much about uh living as humans, and like sort of how we uh look at things around us, and how we interpret things around us, and like how we sort of uh navigate friendships and like love and idols, and so I feel like that sort of obsession people have, it's an obsessive medium, right? It's like people who are obsessed with certain things where it's so hard to just live with it that you need to, which I guess is the same with any creative medium, but like comics I feel sometimes goes in some sense like the extra mile where like you are um creating worlds to sort of put it out there. You're literally like creating a world by yourself, and so it's kind of like being God, but less important.
I'm gonna call on Nika. Do you want to
Yeah,
unmute yourself? Okay, great.
yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Great. Yeah. One, I love you both, Austin. I've gotten into
Oh,
so many great people because of you. Anand, you're just, yeah, one of the best people making
oh,
comics, I think, in
thank you.
the, yeah, yeah, hands down. So I had like three questions, but if I don't want to take up too much time, so I'll just ask the first one, and then if it's okay, I'll ask the other ones. But you do a lot of like great work with surrealism. I don't know what other term to give it. And like, you had mentioned that you like these kinds of like domestic dramas. But it feels like very serious because of maybe the element of paranoia or surrealism that seems to like happen with all the characters. And I was curious if you just like, if that was something that was in your art from before you started comics, or if when you came to comics, you sort of started in on these kinds of surreal stories. and maybe that comes out of the way you produce them. Like you could start with an image first and just kind of keep going. But I was curious if you, yeah, had any thoughts about how you sort of add surrealism or paranoia, or at least for me, it seems like they come up a lot.
I guess I was always obsessed with that sort of world of surrealism, or like even like the bizarreness of it all. Uh, like I don't know how to sort of intellectually analyze it, but I just love when something out of the ordinary happens. Uh, it just, and then sometimes like you sort of create that out of the ordinary, just because of uh, like at the brink of the moment, like very intuitively, and then like over the years you sort of find meaning in it. Uh, like even this Fridge Boy story, like I sort of later realized it is kind of like how, this generation is sort of alienated, or like, kept in the kept in the cold by whoever came before. So I guess it's just always something that I had been fascinated with. And uh and I guess about the paranoia, it's like I'm also a very jittery, anxious person who's like worried constantly. Like throughout my day, I'm worried about like 100 small things. And so I guess like that also seeps in somewhere, this sort of being afraid of the world and being afraid of what is to come, and uh, of a lot of like fears. So I feel kind of like, sometimes surrealism helps you escape it, sometimes it helps you understand it, sometimes like you're bound by it. So I guess it's like always been a part of who I am. Also, like a lot of uh, works which I'd seen, which um, I'm not able to recall them at this moment, but like, a lot of works which I was influenced by, like even something like Jim Jarmusch's Stranger Than Paradise. It has this sort of, I like how it feels, it doesn't have any like, what do you call it? Like any, uh, ex any like fantastical or any surreal moments, but it still feels like there is something fantastical happening. There's something like out of ordinary happening, which I find a lot in like Adrian Terminus work as well, where like it's based in reality. There's nothing, nothing science fiction happening, but at the same time, it feels like there is some sort of like magical thing happening,
Yeah, yeah.
like something out of the ordinary happening. So that is something I really enjoy, where you think that there's some sort of, you know, yeah, feel like I've repeated the same thing
Can
four
I ask one
times,
more
but
question?
yeah, please.
So great answer. I love that. I love this kind of recap of like out of the ordinary, and then like you can find meaning in it later. I thought that was like a really great point. And so just to ask a question that sort of follows from that, one of my the things I was interested in was how you go about building the actual full story. Like you gave some ideas of how you can maybe start, like maybe with the image, maybe with an idea, like a joke, a boy who lives in a fridge, or you get like pop cultural references and you put them in. But at this point, are you sort of writing a script, or are you just like drawing panel by panel? And how do you go about revision if you do like revise? I mean, I just think that they're brilliant, but maybe you have some like you're connected to the spirit world and they just come out perfect like that. I don't know.
No, no, I mean, mostly, like, I feel I spend a lot of months just like in my head, because I'm really bad at like putting things down. Like, I don't really script it per se. It's mostly like I'm sort of reading the story in my mind for like a really long time.
Hmm.
And then, sometimes like something happens, and uh you like I'll write down points if I having like good sort of story arcs, or like this could happen, I could do this with the story. And then eventually, like I guess sometimes if it's dialogue heavy, or if it's like a narrative, like it's a story with like a running narration, I'll write down like the narration, like write the narration down, and then sort of get to finding the image for it, or like um but most of the times I'm not like from the beginning of like a conception, I'm not scripting it. It's usually much later. I'll probably like draw the characters out and see how they're fitting in the story, or like sometimes I'll draw if it's based in a very particular space, I'll draw the space out. So, you know, it depends on on the story itself as well, I guess. Um, like if like in the recent issue of Zoo, um, I forgot to, but like there's this person who works as like this electrician, and there's this person whose reels I used to get quite often. He's like this really energetic uh, guy from somewhere in India who like fixes things. Like he fixes like gas stoves and pressure cookers, and he does it in like this crazy way where he's like beating it out, and like within seconds he's fixing things. And it's like this whole like cluttered room full of like his stuff, and like it was quite fascinating, like this whole space. So I kind of used that as a reference for the store of this character. So, it's just, I guess it's just the act of like finding what you sort of like recognizing what you find interesting and sort of incorporating it in your work, in your comics, and in your storyline. So like I said, like sometimes it's quite I guess it's a chance of luck that you watch something or like read something while you're working on something which pertains to that. And that I think is a it's quite a fascinating process as well, where you you know find that.
Cool. Thank you so much. You are
Yeah,
really a way to get publish more. Just put it out there
yeah.
so we
Thank you. Yeah,
send it to
yeah.
Austin. It's like,
Thank you, Nika. I'm going to ask a question from Julian, a long story short. Would you like to say this out loud, or do you want me to read it for you?
Yeah, I can. Yeah. Well, I say for one, I really like your mixture of like straight drawing and then collage work, and it it's kind of similar to what I do. So it's a nice familiar chord, and also wondering about if we can order individual copies of Zoo.
The first two copies are like out of print. They've been out of print for a while. The third one is in the collection as well, but like I have a lot of copies. So if you'd like, I don't have like a store for people outside of India, but you can always email me. I'll just put my email address in the chat if anybody wants to mail me for my books, or just to have a chat. So you're
Yeah.
all of you can feel free to.
And I'm
Yeah, and I saw their who is it, a Bubble, that they have an anthology of your work.
Yes, yes, yes. And Bubbles, of course, like you can order the collected anthology from Bubbles site. That's like that'll always be there.
I just put a
Yeah,
link into the chat
So
to
yeah,
for you to be
thank
able to
you.
order that book. But you
yeah,
had
I
one
saw
other
that.
question, Julian. Yeah, do you want to? Yeah.
Oh yeah, well I was curious just because I also came across a notice about the Delhi Comics Festival.
Yes.
Yeah, so I'm just curious how that was. Is it a very big event?
It kind of like currently we only have like one sort of group which organizes this festival called Indie Comics Fest, and it happens in like different cities. So instead of like one really big festival, it's like divided into three states, and like it's run by like local volunteers. But I guess it's become considerably big in the sense it's, every year there's more and more participants, there's more and more works coming in, and it's quite nice to see like this sort of community growing. And like the best thing I like is it's not like an industry yet. It's still like a bunch of creators sort of figuring their way out, um, making comics, and sort of figuring out distribution, figuring out like how to publish it. So, but it is, I guess, for the fact that there was not like a huge underground alternative scene. What we have now is, I guess, considerably quite big enough. Not super big, but like big enough.
Well, Isaac,
So,
oh yes, I'm sorry. Continue.
oh, okay. Um, so it does have a number of artists with tables there,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
selling work. And yeah, well, that's good. Yeah, I mean, around the U.S., there's been a gradual increase, like in zine shows, and where you do get a lot of the independent comic artists, and
Yeah,
so
yeah.
it's not nice to see that getting more popular all over. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, yeah.
There was
Thank you, thank you.
a comment. Thank you for that. Those were great questions. I there was a comment in the chat asking for a little more info on what the Indian comic scene is, what it's like, and I think you've talked about it, but I'm kind of curious. I mean, maybe if you look at the mini comics world in the U.S. from the 80s through the 90s, there was different ways of distribution. There were maybe zines that reviewed a lot of zines that you could send your zine to. People were reading them and then they would put money in the mail. But there would also be the culture of going to used bookstores, dropping things off on consignment, and that still exists. All those things still exist, and we have zines like Bubbles that review things and put people in contact with other things through a print medium. But of course, the internet tends to dominate for people contacting their individual self-publishers and getting work from them. I'm kind of interested just here from like the beginning of a process to the completed printed book, how it's felt from you beginning to make, like when you first did this, you're like, okay, I'm going to print this myself. I'm going to the moment that that happens, the first step of like, well, how do people see this beyond myself, if you're the one publishing it, and how that's changed a little bit as you've done a few issues, and whether you find that experience that you've had typical or unique to you.
Um, I guess like I guess the process of like publishing is a little like daunting for other creators, which I get because like it is quite a job to quite a um, it's quite a task to get your things printed in India. And I guess it in some way it's expensive as well, and like but for
Can
me,
I
like
can
because
I
I had
interrupt
that.
and ask? Can I interrupt and
Yeah,
ask
yeah.
in what way you mean it's a task? Because there's been so many changes in how it used to be very awesome, often that people would just when I first experienced mini comics, they were Xeroxed, and now people do that a lot less. There's a lot of risograph printing. There's services like Mixam where people have a service print their comic for them, but it still kind of feels like a zine. So I'm wondering what the process like what makes it a hard task.
I guess the printing shops, like, sometimes they will just refuse to do your zine because it's too complicated. If there's some sort of complex, like for example, of last month I'm printing Bubbles Zine in India, and for Indian audience to read it, to purchase it at a lower rate and like of course for ease of like sending, but like some of them have these inserts which are like smaller in size. So when I showed them, it's like, oh, how will this work? It won't work, it won't happen. So there's that sort of this thing of like they sometimes don't even try to approve if you have like something, offbeat,
Right.
and it's just like a chaotic place. You have to like stand there, and there are like three people who sort of send the information out to the printers,
Mm.
and you just like have to stand for a while, and then eventually they'll take it, and then the printing place is another chaotic this thing. Uh, and I've personally never been like a perfectionist where, like I want the colors just right or like the placement just right. So I get by with like some people, once they get it, like the alignment will be a little off. So I just don't have the patience to, you know, go through it. So I just keep it as simple as possible. And because of the collective, I started in college, like I understood a lot of things, as to even if I'm Xeroxing things, how can I uh, do it like when if it doesn't have any like the marks or like the ink is settled well, like how can I make, design my thing or like edit my thing well enough so that the colors are like the what do you call it? The ink is like, properly distributed. So th small things like that I feel is something which uh is like a challenge. And yeah, I guess when I put the first one out, I just had like some saved up money. So, and it was like offset printed, so it wasn't as expensive. It was like this small print run. Uh, but I mean, I don't remember. Like some people ask me like if I was scared to do it, but I just like did it because I kind of had to. Like I just wanted to, and it just felt like there was nothing else to do. And I guess with every issue, it's like a different reaction. Sometimes, like now I have a bunch of readers who are like excited to read it, but it's not like a great number, but still, I guess it's quite a good, what do you call it? It's a good feeling that people are, awaiting your work, especially like in your community, they're not somewhere far away in some other country, like, people are excited for your work, but it's also like comics and, just, I guess art in some way has never been like a thing people in India invest in some sense. Where like once I was selling the third, when I came out with the third issue, I was selling it at this local bookstore. I was doing like some signing and stuff. And this person came up to me and he's like, "How much is this for?" And I was selling it for 300, which is like $4 or $5. And he was like, "That's a little too much, no, for this." And people think it's a black and white book, so it doesn't, it's nothing new and nothing it's I guess they sort of judge it before they kind of actually read it. So there are all these different like smaller problems. And I guess we never had that sort of, or maybe we did, but not in the sense like comics solely having this, or at least wasn't as big or spread out as the American or like the European underground scene of making comics. There were a lot of like zines, a lot of political zines, which a lot of groups would come out with, of poetry, of like paintings, illustration. But comics itself, I feel like was more prevalent in like, say, newspapers as editorial illustrations or uh, comic strips. So I guess it's not embedded in that way in like public consciousness, where they approach it as a day-to-day object.
Right.
I guess if that like
No, that makes sense. Your publisher, Brian Baines, has a question. Brian, do you want to read this out loud or do you want me to read it for you? Here
Yeah.
comes.
Hey, am I
yeah,
coming
yeah,
up?
Yes, we can hear you.
Sorry, I can't figure it out. Hey,
There you
man. Uh,
hello Brian.
something that I never followed up enough on is your recommendation of Bollywood movies. And so I was curious if the couple that I have seen that you have recommended, they obviously take from different styles of storytelling that is something that's evident in your work as well. And I was just curious if you wanted to recommend a few that really influenced you or ones that you just want to shout out.
Yeah, yeah, of course. There is one that I can think of. It's called Chashme Baddu. I just type it. It's uh it's kind of like this slacker comedy. I hope that's the correct. Uh, it's like a story of these three college friends who live together, and it's like this film from I think the 70s, and it's based in Delhi, and it's really like there's some visual gags there which like work so well, and it's a story which like at that time, every Bollywood film had to be like really grand and like, there like some I mean, these this film also has songs and stuff, but like it's like a very simple story about these three kids, three boys trying to like woo this girl and like um it's like and it beautifully shows the city which like no longer remains how it was shown in the film. So that is definitely one film I would recommend. If you're looking for like a proper grandeur film, there's this one called Pushpa, which came out a few years ago. It's called Pushpa the Rise, but it's insane. It's like it's an experience which you have to experience. And what else? There's this film called Om Darbadar, which I was quite obsessed with as a kid. Um, it's kind of like this very abstract, very surreal film, which never got a, which never got a public release. It was restored and like released 20, 30 years after the film was made. Uh, I came to know some weird things about the director, so I'm not a big fan of it, but still, it's quite an interesting thing that they did in the 80s. Um, with just it's kind of fascinating, and it did sort of some of the dialogues from the film and some of the imagery from the film inspired me quite a lot when like, this is starting out. And then there is what else is there? Hmm.
It's cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
You
Exactly.
can go to Nate or whoever.
Oh yeah.
Thanks,
Yes,
man.
we have. Thank you for that question, Brian. Those are
Yeah.
great things to look up. We have raising hand for a question. Cartoonist Nate Garcia.
So I just wanted to know, no offense to Brian here, you put out the collection of all of your Zeus stories, and I wanted to know if you actively prefer the periodical format for the medium when you're writing and making work. Do you see the comic book as the ideal?
Like you mean the floppy?
Yeah.
Uh, it is definitely like I feel easier in the sense like as I said earlier, like you don't have to approach like a 200, 300 pager at once, work on it for years. You can do it in chunks. And also I wanted to do zoo because in case I ever have a longer story, I can like serialize it and sort of see how people are taking the story, how they are reacting to the story, and then I can even change it in between. But with what I saw with Brian's book is that people do take you more seriously when you have a thicker graphic novel out. People, because floppies for a lot of people, like they feel it gets lost in their bookshelf. They cannot like store it per se. Like
Yeah,
I guess
something's
other,
wrong.
huh?
Something's wrong with those people.
I mean, they don't have dedicated floppy boxes like us,
Yeah.
dedicated. So they want a nice thick book which would go inside their bookshelf. So yeah, generally I found they take a book like this more seriously than like, floppies. But I mean, I love the serialized medium. I feel like it's sort of like even Brian had this really beautiful article in one of his Bubbles issue about like uh the kind of how like things were more like when things were serialized, it had this sort of slowness to it, and it had this sort of, like you had this continuation to with this universe. Like you will, slowly, what will you learn next time? You have this sort of fascination with like, oh, what will happen next? And it, I guess, creates like a much stronger sense of like even with like Alonzo Sneak, Alonzo Snake.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, it's like, oh, how will you take it further? What will happen in the next issue? What will, and how will you develop?
I
It's quite
killed
a,
I killed those characters off,
oh
but I
no.
appreciate that you do the zoo title and that you've done the you seem to appreciate that this comic book like series can be boundless just with even the same title and having it be a periodical. So I really appreciate that.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, like it just, it's just, I guess it's easier for the readers also to sort of base themselves, like even if every issue has different characters or different visual language, it's still like they know that if they're reading Zoo, it's got to be like a certain like it's going to go to a certain direction. So, that's always helpful, like to have a running series, I guess. And it's when I started Zoo, I really wanted it to be like a quarterly thing or like once and twice in a year. But then I realized it takes like 2, 3 months just to get the book out in the world. And when you're doing everything alone, like you're your own publicist, you're your own PR, your own, distributor. So it's like once the book is out, then it's a completely different journey it goes on.
I do
Yeah.
think the graphic novel form presents like an economic problem to cartoonists. I don't know if this is something that you might have experienced, but it's with serializing a work, if a cartoonist has a certain kind of audience, they can put something out slowly and put the work out, people buy the work, and they can slowly build and have little infusions of reactions from from readers, um, so they're not working in a vacuum, and a little bit of financial contribution for serializing the story. Whereas graphic novels seem to ask this thing where it's like, yeah, just for 5 years, I guess, work on this, and it's all you can do, and having that, that just seems like such a harder. That seems like a harder model for it's sort of like asking every cartoonist if they were filmmakers to make like a 10-hour epic film rather than a
Yeah.
so it's tough.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, which is also like something which I would want to do, like, work on a longer format work, like,
Yeah.
spend more time. Uh, because I mean, of course, like a smaller story can also have an equally, what do you call it? An equal amount of impact as like a 200 pager. But still, it's interesting to sort of delve in with the character longer and not just like spend some 20, 30 pages with it and see like the complete range of things you can do with it. So, you know, my wife has this comic called Shampoo and Daddy, which she was serializing for a year as like these 24 page, 12 page smaller zines. And then she compiled into a book. So, it's like with every chapter, it's like the character is, and it really pushes. I don't think I have it here, but it really pushes like what you can do with like just the comics medium, and uh, you know, it's fun like to spend more time with it.
Is there a place we could find that? Or is there
Oh yeah, I guess you can also, if you're in India, you can uh, what do you call it? Get it from her store, but if you're from, I think she had, I'll attach her Instagram
thank you.
and like her email, which is like,
Okay. I'm gonna move on to
yeah.
we have two questions in the chat, and then I think I'm gonna especially because our guest is up early and has taken so much time with us. I'm gonna if someone has a question beyond these two, ask now, because then I'm gonna cut them off. So I believe is this Cameron Arthur asking this question? Um, Cameron, do you want to get on screen, or would you like me to read this for you? I'm not hearing from Cameron. If this is Cameron Arthur, one of my favorite contemporary cartoonists right now, someone who I think makes really, really beautiful work. And Cameron asks, since the publication of the Bubbles collection, do you have a larger audience of readers in India or here in the US? Or are the audiences about general?
Uh, I think it might be slightly more in the US. Uh, or it maybe it's like a more reactive, not reactive, but like a more what do you call it? A more
Engaged?
more engaging audience that I get from the US, more than India, I'm guessing so. But I guess it's
Well, we're good for something then. We're we,
yeah, yeah. Definitely, definitely. I mean, I feel like, it's relatively much newer, and even for, I guess, like my peers, like my contemporaries, it's um a much like a kind of relatively um medium which they don't have a lot of, like, how, for example, in America there are like hundreds of people making uh like, comics which are led by stories and led by characters, not just like zines which are a mix of illustration and words. It's like stories being told and, like, characters that you follow. I guess that is sometimes I feel it's, not as many people doing that, and which I understand because it is something which takes a lot more time and like a lot more mental space, and like it's not something you can easily do while like maintaining like a day job and maintaining like financial responsibilities. I am I live with my parents, and like I sort of manage by myself, so I don't have to like immediately think about this thing, which I mean, uh, what do you call it? But yeah, like I diverted like far off, but like I feel it's just a new medium, which like I feel sometimes I feel like more people should be engaging, uh, you know, more. I think I should stop. I might get into like some salty zone where
oh well,
people aren't
that's
working
we should
hard enough.
definitely continue. Um, Julian, do you want to read this question?
Um, yeah, yeah. So I was wondering what in 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 India, what the general public thinks about independent comics and zines and artists. Do they accept them, or is there kind of an objection to the more personal style of work?
I
As
think the
far as
general
their
public,
taste goes.
hmm, hmm, hmm. I mean, I don't think the general public knows that much about independent comics and zines. Hmm, in that sense, where I guess it just hasn't been uh like, space as well for it to exist in a space where, like, someone who's not an artist or someone who's not from a creative field is able to access it. Like earlier, there were more like newsstands and like magazine stalls. Those have come down quite a bit. I once tried to give my book to like like there are a lot of these roadside booksellers who sell like bootleg editions of, you know popular English language books. l- Harry Potter and stuff like that. So I tried to give it to one of them, but he seemed quite disinterested, hearing the price as well. Like when I told him like he can sell it for lesser, but he showed me like a very commercially published, popular children's comic book, and he's like, "See, this is in color, and it's still cheaper than your comic. How can I sell your comic for a much bigger rate when it's in black and white?" And I tried to tell him the commerce of like it's more expensive to print in color. And he's like, well, you have to put in some effort to, do something. So, it's like, which is fine. Like, it's like he probably knows the business better than I do. So what I'm trying to get to at is like, um, I guess like sometimes I give my comics to this friend of mine who runs a record store in India, in Delhi, and he has like a bunch of things which he sells, and he sells my comics as well. So there are a lot of people like pick it up, but I guess it's mostly like other musicians and students who cannot afford to like buy an LP or a cassette, but like a comic book is still a little more affordable to them. Uh, but like it never sort of goes into um like this. I mean, some bookstores do keep it, but like not enough. It's still like independent bookstores. It's, I guess, hasn't reached that sort of general public, which, um, people who are not even remotely connected to the art. That can be said about a lot of things, which hasn't reached. And I feel comics is a medium where, it has to be like physically present, and like say being like an independent musician and putting your work out on YouTube where everybody can access it. This is something which has to be like given to you. It has to be bought. It has to be, there is some level of like effort which has to be put by the reader to get it. And I feel currently, like when I started, I wanted like everybody to read it. I wanted, people who aren't artists to read it, who uh but now I guess I'm making some sort of peace with just like other artists and designers and cartoonists and students reading it, because like that's also, I guess they're still your readers. So uh but yeah, like I just feel it'll take some time for it to reach like this everyday audience. And you know, I guess it's I guess it's fine. I guess things take time, and you cannot have overnight success with such things. It has to be like slowly ingrained in the public consciousness. And um I guess like the art community in general is sort of struggling with that in India at least.
There is a question from Isaac Roller, and they say, if it's not too late, or Isaac, do you want to read this question? I can read it for you. If it's not too late, can I ask you if there are any other Indian cartoonists you can recommend? Either one of your contemporaries or someone who does more mainstream stuff but stands out from the crowd.
Yeah, there are several. I mean, I mentioned my partner Aditi Mali, Good Bad Comics. She makes like really excellent stuff. She has been working on it for quite a while, and I really love her work. Then there's my friend Partha Banik. He is also an excellent. Uh, he is, I guess, mostly like an artist, but he also makes comics. 2, 3 years ago, he had put out like a almost like a full length 100-pager graphic called Dhruvo Tara. It's in Bengali, but like the drawings are really striking. Brian is also a big fan of Partha's work. I think it's 21 yellow dots on Instagram. If you,
Oh, yeah,
uh,
I've seen that work. It's
yeah.
great.
So he's really good. And then there is Bhanu, of course. Everybody knows Bhanu in the alternative
Pratap.
scene. And like,
Oh, no, Pratap.
huh? Yeah,
Pratap.
Bhanu Pratap.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah. He's really
Symposium
good.
guest.
Oh yeah, yeah, of course. I had seen his Symposium. He is he's really good. And then um
There's someone, Bibo Swan Bobby.
yeah,
Uh,
Bibo Swan. So Bibo and Bhanu are like really good friends. They are like what do you call it? Early internet friends. And both of them work really closely. I think Bibo doesn't make as much comics now. He's a PhD scholar and he's working on his PhD. So, but like excellent artist and his trajectory, like I recently came to know he used to work for a lot of like commercial comic book publications and like make a lot of like superhero comics. And even that work was like really striking. It was quite different. And then he kind of like took this turn and he makes like very um abstract form comics, but it's great stuff. And then there are, I mean, there are quite a few. I'm like blanking out, but uh, every year, like at Comics Fest, there is someone who there is Fala. I think Fala. He runs this comic called Musalman Comics, which is like this kind of superhero character he created, and it's kind of like a tongue-in-cheek comic about like the current like political scenario in India, and it's quite fun. It's quite fun work. Uh, but yeah, I mean,
those are great.
everybody can follow Indie Comics Fest. They also post a lot about up and coming artists. They do a lot of like meetings and comic meetups and discuss like what everybody's been up to. So they're good. Like I guess that's the only one currently which but it's kind of like a big organism where uh there's separate parts. There's one in Kerala which is like down south, and they're more involved in like talking and like conserving old Malayalam comics, and like they have a lot of like very involved members who make comics, who talk about comics. So it's interesting. It's like one thing, but there are like several things within it, considering like India is quite a big country, and like several states have had like quite rich comic histories, which never really like sort of developed into uh, like a widespread sort of alternative phase. But like the old stuff is still like really interesting and like really intriguing to see
Um,
like
Thanks for that. This is Isaac. I got my microphone working.
okay.
Is Hi. Is there anyone like from the past of comics that's like a big figure or like kind of groundbreaking, or like is there like a godfather of alternative comics?
uh I guess there's hard to pinpoint one person, but there is Abid Surti, who, I mean, he's done like quite a lot of things. Abid's, I'm not sure if I'm spelling it correctly, but he sort of he used to write for comics, and he has this character called Bahadur, who is like this sort of detective who goes around fighting crime. But it had like very interesting sort of political leanings, and like how it sort of showed a lot of themes was it was quite uh ground. This was like the 70s and the 80s. So he's quite an interesting figure in the sense he's done quite like variety of work. And one thing he used to do, like he's from Bombay, and he used to think like he came to know that a lot of water wastage happens in Bombay because of like broken taps and like dripping all day. So he would go house to house fixing people's taps. So that is also like one aspect of what he's done. But like he used to run a comic strip as well called Daboji, which was translated into different languages. So he is, I guess you can call him in some sense, someone who sort of changed the medium in some sense with his writing, with his artwork. So I guess Abid Surti, and then uh there was like, I mean, an interesting era, at least like visually, of like there was this publication called Raj Comics, which used to do like, which they still do, but like it's not as charming anymore, I guess. There is an element of nostalgia where it was like superhero comics and they had these different characters with like each of them had their own quirks, but like very Indian, very like in some ways very nationalist as well. But like the drawings are like quite interesting, quite fun to look at least in the visual sense. So yeah, these were, I guess, I bet I'm like missing out like
No,
a
that's
lot of
great. Those are great.
yeah, but like I was so yeah,
Yeah, thanks.
that's I guess
Got my research
yeah.
set out for me.
Yeah.
Thank you, Isaac.
Yeah,
I,
thanks.
I'm gonna leave you with one question, Anand, and we're coming up on 2 hours, and I'm sure many people in the audience, it's midnight here in the States, so
Oh
I
yeah, yeah.
have kind of a complicated question, but I'll maybe we can limit it to a quick discussion. But you mentioned the whatever the political situation is in India now, which I am largely ignorant of, but I kind of wanted to know. In terms of what it means to be an artist in the US in this moment, and not limited to this moment, in a way, we can talk about all different kinds of artistic responses that people have to the specific situation or specific situations. But one thing I see happening over the last 70 years, while there might be more artists now than at any other time in our country's history, in a way, the time for artists to think and reflect on their work, to have rent that's easier to knock out, and a maybe a day job that provides some kind of wage that allows for that and allows for some free time, which I think is essential to bringing everything you can to your work. I can't see any other reality that has become for a lot of people more and more challenged over every year for decades and decades and decades, kind of reaching I think like ahead now. And I think people who make art really do struggle with that reality in this country right now. So I would that's one aspect of our country's political reality that I think relates to being an artist. And I'm wondering, I don't, of course, would not ask you to summarize everything to report to us about things and explain it to us. But I'm wondering if that's if you see if there's some parallel and whether that's been the case for a long time or has become exasperated, just the ability for people to have time to make work and reflect on their work they're doing outside of just the economics of simply supporting themselves.
Um, you mean to say like, is it harder to
I'm
survive
just
as
kind
an
of
artist?
wondering, yeah, I'm kind of wondering for someone for a typical person who wants to bring their all to their work, especially something like comics where the economics are very humble. Um, yeah, what that might mean and how hard that might be now versus at any other time. But yes, specifically now.
Yeah, I think it is definitely quite hard now because it's quite hard to sell your things, if you're like, especially if you're making comics where like, especially if you're making it independently, where you're dependent on the sales of it. Um, and like as I said, it's not like a, you know, what do you call it? Like a public medium or like a commercially accessible medium, which I guess also works in some sense in its to its benefit because uh also like I mean India has become a little more like strangely intolerant with what it recently there was this whole thing about there's this sort of like this comedy show like this reality comedy show, it's hard to describe it, but this one guy who's like a proper like a right wing podcaster of sorts who said this sort of weird joke on it. and he is like in like a lot of shit for that, to a point where like his family is being harassed and he cannot, his passport is revoked, and it's like, people are, losing their minds over it, in the sense like, nobody is exactly safe. Like you can say a joke, like just a pass, and it wasn't even like an original joke. It was like some old shit which he said, and it's just like, I guess, uh making people a little um wary about, like, what exactly is happening, what exactly could get you into. Also, in that sense, I feel like comics is safe from that, that it's not like this public medium where somebody will, like, even, like, I feel Bhanu summarized it very well once when he said that, it's like an inside joke, and everybody who reads comics is on it. Everybody who reads comics understands it. They want to, like, really get offended over something, just for, they understand, like, the sort of sensibilities behind it. So I feel like
Good way
there's
to put
that
it.
aspect. Yeah, I feel like there's that aspect of creation where, you don't want to, you don't know what will offend someone, what you say will sort of touch somebody in the wrong way. But there's also the commercial aspect of it, which I'm still like trying to wrap my head around. Like some people who make art, I don't think anybody in India is making any money out of comics, or like sustainable money out of comics. But like some people who are into design and illustration seem to be, at least online, they seem to be doing quite well at, like, sort of creating a livelihood out of it. But I still would want people to, be a little more, like, sort of delve, and a lot of people are doing it as well, but like I want to see more of that obsession with their medium, more of that sort of, pushing boundaries with that medium. Whereas a lot of, like, especially like the fine arts, this thing becomes more about like the market and like who you're being represented by, or like, who has your work. Um, but then, like, sometimes the experimental zone becomes too experimental for me, and I get a little distance from that as well. So I guess, like, I'm I'm not the correct person to talk about it. I'm
No,
like,
no, no, that was a
I have
great.
this very I have this very specific, like, thin line about like what I like and what I enjoy, and then, I guess it comes to everyone.
I'm going
you
to
know
just I'm going to ask the
yeah.
final question here, and
Okay.
it's from Swayam and Andrew Alexander has signed this question, and great cartoonist and publisher. Is Ram why we I'm sorry,
Vairkar.
Waikar influential for underground comics, or is he very mainstream?
I'm just going to quickly Google and to make sure that I know that I'm talking about the same person. But I think it's the, oh yeah, yeah. He was also, like, when I showed Tinkle, he was one of the illustrators for Tinkle. And I guess he is uh like Tinkle as well. Like, it was quite popular, but still, like, I find people who have never, like, it was never like a part of their childhood. But whoever childhood was part of, um and like I never read it, in the sense like, oh, I recognize this artist, oh, this artist. But now that I look back at his work, I'm like, he did quite a lot of interesting things with, like, the medium, and like just with, like, he had this very free way of drawing. But again, like, I never see these influences in the same way, like how American alternative cartoonists sort of use the DNA of, like, old, say, Jack Kirby comics, or like old, say, like how they use. Nancy and like, or Peanuts, and how they sort of get influence from that work. I guess it's generally like an Indian thing not to try to create something more original, or like this sort of want to create, because I once remember meeting this cartoonist who was like drawing like Simpsons characters, and he asked me like, do you guys draw other characters in your free time? And I realized I never, it's very rare that you see people do that in a more um productive sense, in a more not productive sense like that, but like in a more sense that it's seeping in their work more like
More
proactively, or
digested, maybe more digested.
yeah, in the sense like they're sort of, what do you call it, sort of using it, mm, because like it's kind of like helpful for the reader also to digest it, right? When they see some uh aesthetic or like some sort of language which they're more aware of, like how you draw backgrounds or how you draw characters. When you see something which you read prior to, you kind of, it's easier, slightly easier for you to get like, how Seth sort of takes from New York Times cartoons and like how he draws buildings or how he draws characters. It's more like there's a familiarity to it. So I feel that sort of familiarity people don't, or they take from like other mediums. Um, so I feel like that way we have not done. I mean, there are some artists who, bring that influence. There is this person, Sumit Kumar, who uh, runs this website called Bucker Max, who is like a huge, Indian comics buff. And he talks a lot about these influences, about like Ram Verkar and Pran and like people who has been, but I guess I would love to see more of it. I'd love to see people dissecting those artists and sort of bringing in that to contemporary Indian comics. I would, I would totally read that.
That's a great answer, and we're gonna end there. Thank you so much for your time, Anand.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you so much
This
for having me.
This was
Yeah.
beautiful, and thanks everyone for their questions. And I'm gonna put again in the link. We're gonna post this to our YouTube page. There's a link to it, which will have this talk and many others. Um, and yes, thank you again so much. And I really encourage people to, if they're in the US, pick up this book from Bubbles. And thank you so much. And next week we will have Lily Correa will be hosting the symposium, and she is going to have Chris Sullivan as her guest, and that will be Lily Correa is a cartoonist and animator. Chris Sullivan is an animator who's going to be talking about working on a animation over a long period of time. So that'll probably be very fascinating. That will be on a special Friday session, not on Tuesday. So I encourage everyone to register for that. Thank you again so much.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for having me. It was really great. And thanks to everyone who joined in for all
Yes,
the
wonderful
questions.
questions.
Yeah.
Take
Thanks,
care.
Anand and Austin.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye, you
you.
guys. Bye, everyone.
Have a good day. All right.
You too. Thank you.